what is the single most important message to say the Japanese readership and audience who are reasonably knowledgeable about how information economy works and who are maybe in or around the information industries and services, maybe not for profit, maybe
Yeah.
some of the tech companies. Yes, what would you say? And some people are in the policy circle.
So I would say, so I also would try and give it in a nutshell. So in a nutshell, this book tells you like 5 hidden rules that explain how the information age works that are kind of hiding in plain sight, these rules, if you read the book. But they're not obvious to most people. They're not visible, and they're not visible how they fit together to explain a lot of the major events happening, like the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of tech monopolies, and most importantly, what the book explains is what we can do about it. There are many people now telling us, hey, there's a problem. I think we're now getting aware there's a major problem, but what can we do about it? We don't just want government to regulate every monopolist. It's not going to really work. What happens about the next one? And this book gives us a very exciting solution that's about open, but it's also about how we pay and pay for innovation and incentivize innovation. And I think it provides an incredible kind of merging of what I'd call like an open approach and a kind of free markets approach. So it's kind of like, I like to say, it's like capitalism and socialism had a baby in the information age. And this, what they would produce would be remuneration rights, which is part of the solution described in the book. So if what you'll get from the book is both really deep insight into what's happening and why it's happening and what else you can predict that's going to happen, and whether you want to build a business and be an entrepreneur, whether you're you're an activist or you're working non-profit and you want to make a better information age that's fairer and freer, or whether you're a policymaker who just wants to make your country innovative, competitive, but also deal with social inequalities, inclusive growth, the future of work. This book has a lot of solutions and ideas for you. Is that better?
Yeah, great job. Thank you. Yes, you just did it in 3 minutes. Wow. Okay, so may I just ask you some more smaller scale questions so that it will not, the video will include some interactions. Yeah.
Right. And I also think you can divide your video up. If you've got enough material, you can always release chunks. You might have the event, but you can use other chunks over time on Facebook.
Okay.
Like,
yeah.
It's 2 minutes. Anyway, let's
go. So maybe we'll use this 3 minute and your self-introduction as the video message, but the longer part, maybe we will release it later as like bonus material or something. And so I wonder, since you published the book in 2018, did you get any surprise reactions, receptions that went beyond or outside of your imagination?
Yeah, I have had surprise reactions. I think, well, one thing is just to say the translation. I mean, there's a translation in Chinese underway.
Okay.
There's a translation in German. There's so I there's several other people. So I'm very excited to have seen that. I think, but yeah, no, I mean, I think the thing is, I don't know. I always have the story. I know there's a couple of books that are quite. There's like several books. I don't know whether the book, what will ever happen exactly with the book, but I'm always heartened by the story of. There's a book called The Power of Now by like Eckhart Tolle, which might people have heard of. And there's another book. There's a guy who's really like famous now, who kind of did cognitive behavioral therapy. And he wrote these books, like no one was reading them, and then like 3 years later, somehow it got mentioned somewhere and then loads of people read it. I think in my experience so far, because I have talked to kind of quite a few policymakers since, or others, people are now really aware there's an issue, but there tends to be kind of, when you say, I would say there's the kind of, there tends to be a sort of superficial framing of the problem a little. And I don't mean super, I mean, it sounds superficial can be, but I mean, it's a surface level. So people are aware there's a monopoly problem now, but there's there's still a tendency to be like, okay, well, how do we address monopolies? We're going to go and have some antitrust. When there's really a systemic, it's not like, it's kind of a systemic issue. And if you look back a century and a half, in the US, when antitrust laws first happened in the US, and there was a systemic Carnegie, ultimately, I mean, the US, it was sort of complicated, but in many other countries, people sort of nationalized a lot of stuff, or they intervened in the economy quite a lot in the early stages of what I'd call industrial, like large scale industrial capitalism. It wasn't a pretty sight if you just left the free market to itself. It didn't go very well. And what I think is interesting in this case is in the old system, it was a bit odd. Either you're going to nationalize things, which is not a great, it's kind of okay, but there's a lot of limitations to the state owning large enterprises, you know, which we've discovered. In this area, we don't have to have that. We can have something like remuneration rights, which combines the free market and free enterprise, but with a way of like kind of ensuring good competition and ensuring openness and kind of ongoing innovation. You know, my experience, you know, I've been on a few different things. It just isn't understood by the majority of people or policymakers. Like, what is it systemically that's different about the information age, and what can you do about it? So, for example, the models of remuneration rights also kind of, people talked about them since the early 2000s at least. You know, like there was something called alternative compensation. The idea is kind of been around. I don't know. I think there's also got to. So I think though the time is right. You know, in my experience of policy making at least, or social ideas, people will talk about them. You know, and then at some point they're sort of adopted. You know, whether you're a right wing or a left winger, maybe you know the left wing. You know, Marxist ideas were around for, you know, when Marx died, it didn't look like Marx was going to be very popular, you know, like, you know, and similarly, when Milton Friedman, or if you're a right winger, you know, when people talked about free markets in the 50s and 60s, were like, you know, there's all this problem with the state level of state intervention. People are like, oh, you know, Milton, you know, what, nothing's ever, you know, everyone thinks running fine. People didn't anticipate that by the end of the 70s, you know, many countries would have adopted these much more free market ideas. So I think what I would say right now is there's such the force of history is with these ideas, because you look at Spotify even. I think that's a good example. People were selling music one track at a time. No one does that now. No one's selling movies pretty much one, you know, you subscribe to Netflix. There's the general direction of travel towards like pay once, unlimited consumption, which is sort of the open model, is, I think, very powerful. But I think it could go the way of more monopoly, like Netflix or Spotify are sort of a monopoly. They're at a different level of the monopoly, but they're a sort of monopoly. So I don't know. Like, I don't know if it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, certainly the thing I can predict right now is if we keep running on monopoly rights, there's going to be a lot more inequality, and a lot more inequality in power, and that is leading to populist issues. And I think that's something that's becoming visible to the political elites, that we should do something about that. What they should do is not very obvious to them. In my experience, like you look at the US, where there's been, Elizabeth Warren had a proposal. They're not proposals I would be like, yeah, that really is going to solve it. Like none of them have proposed remuneration rights yet, but I think that there will be one. There'll be a presidential candidate in the United States in the next decade who will propose something like remuneration rights, I suspect.
So compared to remuneration right regime, you would say that, you know, breaking up the tech giants are like kind of like playing a whack-a-mole, where
Yes.
volcano erupts, you try to extinguish it fire, but it doesn't really address the tectonic shift that's occurring.
Yeah, exactly. And the metaphor here is, whereas the plates we can't do anything about, but imagine that we could somehow solve the fact that they're tectonic plates. Like they would just rub, there would no longer be friction. They kind of, we could somehow oil the plates and they would just slide gently under each other. There'd be no more earthquakes and volcanoes. That's what's kind of possible for us. And so you're exactly right, Tomo, that essentially at the moment, a lot of the discussion is whack-a-mole. We're going to break up this person, or, you know, that's very difficult to do. Very few breakups have now been, given the way that antitrust has gone, that will be very difficult in the US, especially, which is where many of them are based. I think it's whack-a-mole. Even if you solve one, then the next one's going to come along because it's systemic. That's the thing I explain in my book that I think is really important. This is not some accident like one happened. This is to do with the laws of costless copying leading to law of one, which leads to monopoly when you have monopoly rights. Once you have that, it's just going to keep happening. And I think the other thing that's not visible at the moment that I think is actually problematic is people don't really, particularly policymakers and even others, don't really understand the cost in terms of innovation. I think it's I like to say it's the children that are not born. Imagine, imagine some child one night, like, I don't know, one night a guy, was going home to his wife and then he got delayed in the traffic and therefore they didn't make their baby that night, and it would have been Einstein, it would have been a genius. That's the baby that was never born. It's very difficult to see that. Similarly, when an innovation is killed off or stifled by a monopolist, we never see what it would have become. But we are seeing it, which is, I think, what everyone said, look, the information age should be incredibly innovative, should be incredible GDP growth. And we're not seeing that. We're actually seeing stagnating GDP growth at the moment in many countries relatively. And I think that is partly related to the fact, compared to the 90s, that we have much more restricted innovation space. If you're a company, it's very rare. Let's even take, you've got Facebook, but what's the one company they haven't taken over? I'm forgetting their name at the moment, but they've had a lot of problems. The Snapchat, Snapchat didn't allow themselves to be acquired. They were offered $3 billion or whatever, but they've had a really tough time. There are many other examples where Google have, I really think there's good, evidence on that front. So I think that's the other thing that's there at the moment. So I think you're totally right that the antitrust approach, the metaphor, maybe to end, the metaphor I have on antitrust is, imagine we had a pollution. This is the other metaphor. You have pollution of a river, like you're at the estuary and there's all this pollution and there's loads of little rivulets, like it's like this, it's like at the ocean, it's like loads. We're going around trying to clean up. And but there's just more and more pollution all the time. We clean it up, there's more pollution. Because way upstream, there's a factory spilling out pollution. And what we need to do is go upstream and deal with the factory, But if you don't deal with the factory, you're just going to keep cleaning up stuff at the estuary and it's going to be very inefficient and it's never going to go away. Whereas if you go upstream and you apply your filter to the factory, there's no more pollution. And that's part of it. You need to go to the root of this problem, which is costless copying with monopoly rights. If you want to keep costless copying, because that's amazing, but you want to change monopoly rights into remuneration rights, and the problem would start going away.
I see. So another question, if I may. So I get so many answers already to my questions. Okay, another one. How about this? So I do see the benefits of remuneration rate regime, but also I wonder, like compared to say Creative Commons license suites, the regime you propose is kind of one size fits all. So from the perspective of the creator, you don't get to choose 1 out of 6 license types, but you just have to open up all your rights, and you may get attribution and you may get the fair compensation, but you don't get to choose, for example, to refuse commercial exploitation or refuse creation of derivative works or anything else. Yeah. And I can expect some people strongly resist on that and advocate for greater range of choices. What would you say to that?
Well, I think it's two things. I mean, I think um, one just to say at the beginning is in terms of introducing this model, because that's a really big question. So how do we get there from here? You know, how do we get to remuneration rights? Is you could do it on a voluntary sort of licensing basis, um, just like we do with collecting societies for music today. In theory, I mean, everyone sort of does license, but you can kind of voluntary license. Or even you've seen with Spotify, some musicians chose not to license their music to Spotify. Most ended up doing so, but I don't know, the Beatles at some point, or didn't do so. So you could imagine a voluntary regime where people kind of license into the remuneration rights fund if they want to, and most people do because they would like them, money. It's a good offer. Or they like the fact that their music is shared and that is used and is played and is available. Because you can also imagine, once I'm a radio station, or imagine I'm building an app with music, I can either go and just get the remuneration rights music, which is open, is easy to access, or I have to go and negotiate and work out whether this thing is licensed or not licensed, or, it's going to be a lot easier. There's going to be a huge incentive for people to use music that's remuneration rights licensed, sort of. I think on a deeper question of like, would there be at some point, just like, we don't let everyone choose their copyright, like copyright does expire, patents do expire. Ultimately, it's a deep question. Like, there's even this question of ownership. I think this is a very questionable area. I mean, no idea in my book is mine. Like, no idea was like, I didn't sit in some room with no influence from anyone and create my book. And it's just the product of my imagination, my spirit. I've stood on the shoulders of not only of all of the previous kind of humanity and thinkers, but also many dozens of people today. It's why, in fact, we don't want patents and copyright traditionally on like Einstein's theory of relativity, like really core ideas, or mathematics. There's so many people who contributed to them, but also so many people who would use them, that it would be a nightmare if there were all these little rights. I had to work out who owned what. What did Einstein really invent the theory of relativity all on his own, or does he own, and we see that, by the way, today, like really key technologies like CRISPR for gene editing, there's been huge litigation between different people about who invented it first. Was it in this lab, or this person went from this lab to this lab? And so I think there's a really profound question, which is to say, we want to pay people. We want people to be able to make a living because it costs time and energy to contribute to ideas. But in this world where we're constantly trying to be like, oh, it's mine. Yes, in remuneration rights, we have to work out to some extent to allocate the money. But I think this model of encouraging people, or even in some extent saying, look, it's not yours. It's not somehow your thing. Yes, you should be compensated. We should have some way to fairly pay entrepreneurs, artists, etc. And this is something that was actually a product of all of our creative potential to some extent. And so let's share it. Let's make it open. So my sense, that's also a kind of like almost more spirit. I don't say spiritual, but more like kind of ethical or kind of conceptual, philosophical answer. But finally, I also want to say, which is the great criticism that I have of the Creative Commons suite of licenses, and there's many, there's one, I've participated in Creative Commons for a whole bunch of period, but the great critique I have of the non-commercial and the kind of restricted derivatives are they break up the commons. I mean, it's why I've said the Creative Commons should change their name to like License Choice, Inc. or License Choice org, because it isn't a commons. The set of licenses that you then have are not a commons. They don't produce information that can be shared and intermingled. They produce mutually incompatible. I'm not sure many people who use Creative Commons licenses realize that, but they actually, once you have no derivatives and once you have, non-commercial, you break up the commons. And that's, just taking one example, everything on Wikipedia, which is open, not most of the photos in the world are non-commercial license, which are Creative Commons license. None of them can be used on Wikipedia. So this is, I think, the more also finally practical answer on that is to say, I think that those they break up the commons, and that a lot of the advantage of open is a commons, because it means freedom to innovate, freedom to access without having to have a lawyer, without all this complexity. So I think that one of the practical answers. There's kind of three answers to why I wouldn't allow license choice, and I would encourage people openly licensing. They might have attribution, or I have attribution, and so on, but that you wouldn't allow like no derivatives, and you wouldn't allow non-commercial restrictions.
Thank you. I wonder if you want me to ask any particular question? Do you want to answer any particular question, or did I miss? Of course, I can go on. Yeah.
You can go on. I mean, there's no particular question. I think the thing that I would also is, what can we do? One thing is to say to the audience, what can you do? Like, what could you do practically to bring about what I call an open information age, an age in which all non-personal information, or software, or music, or movies, or, you know, you name it, is open and free for anyone to use, share, build on, and artists, innovators, entrepreneurs are recognized and rewarded. And so I think this kind of, what, if you ask me a question, what can people do?
Yeah. What would you say?
One thing I think very simply is, if every person who read the book or listened to this organized maybe a meal with their friends, just said, like, you know, you're going to go out, maybe it's just your friends, maybe it's your family, and try to explain, share the ideas, ask what people thought. I think there are a lot of people, you know, like, how do we share other complicated ideas in a way in the past? Because it kind of is complicated to people. It's not an obvious relationship between what, you know, why are things happening? But I think if we got people also off the obsession about privacy, often people focus on privacy. I don't think that's the issue. But if you went into your friends, so one thing you can do is just have one meal with 6 people where you share about these ideas, and more importantly, ask them what they think. Do they care about information monopolies? Do they want a better way? And then maybe some of them read the book and they then run another meal. If everyone did, like, you know, we had 6 people share, and then they share, and then they share. And it's more important not about the book, but about the ideas. That's what I really care about. It's just the book is a good summary of the ideas. And then the other thing that I would really invite people to do is to try and put, you know, I don't know in Japan, but you have your political parties will have meetings every year or every 2 years or something, where they decide about what their policy is. And in this area, I think there's a real opportunity to write a short paper explaining the ideas. I have another project called the IMED project that has a really simple slide deck explaining the idea for medicine, how you do remuneration rights for medicine. And I have other examples for newspaper, and try and get a political party to actually take up this idea in their manifesto. Actually be like, okay, in this area, maybe it's not for everything, it's going to be for medicines, or it's going to be for news, because news isn't getting paid for nowadays, or it's going to be for music or something. You attempt to get, you write a short summary, and you just try and send it to most of the political parties, say, hey, can we come to your conference and present about these ideas? Because I think if you got one person in a political party who got it, he was like, oh, yeah, there is a real issue, and this could be a really good, you know, that would be amazing. Once one party's talking about it, other parties will talk about it. And that's the way that you'll get political kind of traction. So I think those are the 2 things I'd say. Have a party with your friends and just ask them, what do they think about, you know, Google or Facebook or Tencent or whatever? And what do you think we should do about it? And, oh, here's these ideas. What do you think? And then have that share. That's one way to share these ideas, which I think are really interesting and important. And, you know, I end on that is to say, in the early 1960s, so I just pause there, that's what I asked, but where we are is in the early 1960s, there's a book written called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And at that point, environmental matters just really weren't something people talked about. I mean, people who cared about the environment mainly were about parks and things like that. And that book was transformative. And maybe not even just the book, but that was the moment when people went from early 60s where people didn't talk about it to the 1970s, where you had, you know, Earth Day with like 10 million people worldwide participating, you know, a sudden awareness of the environment as a big issue, which is obviously today where we have climate change. I mean, it's just the number 1 global issue potentially. And I think similarly, we're at that beginning point about the information age and about what's not working about it and what could work about it. And And I think that this is the moment, this is the beginning. So if you're here right now, you're at the beginning of what will become a worldwide movement, no doubt about it.